The first speaker is, my father, Lyle Novinski, professor and chairman emeritus from the University of Dallas. The Novinskis and the Cistercians go way back. It was the Cistercians when they were in Wisconsin who connected with my Wisconsin-born father and brought our family to Dallas, and that's why we're here. So we've been way back before the school itself. We've had this connection to Cistercian. My father is an artist. If you've been in the church in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, you've probably seen his work, whether that's the furnishings at the Chapel of the Incarnation, the altar, the lectern, the baptistry, the stained glass windows at St. Rita's, the terracotta surround of Prince of Peace in Plano, which is also designed by Gary, the Perkins Chapel at SMU, the Newhoff Chapel and the Student Center at SMU, Holy Cross in South Dallas. I mean, these are all places that my father has done the work for. Gary Cunningham, of course, went to Cistercian and then proceeded to design several of our buildings. And I think he too is a genius in his own right. And I think that this room is a great example of that. What was a science center lecture hall that we tried to use for drama productions, that he was found a way to make into a theater. And you can still see where the carpeted steps used to be for this sort of terrace, and the ability to take a walkway and make it into a lobby and add for us a balcony and make a theater space out of what was a science lecture hall is just a little sample of the greatness that he's come up with over the years. They're both going to talk about their own journeys in some sense as well, because they knew O'Neill when they were young men, and not that they're both old now, but he formed them in some ways, and their own journey as artist and architect, and how they were formed by the spaces and the circumstances of their own lives. So without further ado, I ask your attention first for Professor Novinski and then for Mr. Cunningham. After that, we will take the journey over to the chapel and talk more specifically about the chapel itself, and we might stop elsewhere on campus depending on weather and time. So without further ado.
Well, it's great to be here. I started my lecture earlier. We did this for the lower formers. That my first introduction to the Cistercians and to this place went way, way back to a class at the University of Wisconsin. I was in a jewelry class, and I had made for myself a new medal, a scapular medal. In that growing way of artists wanting to get rid of all old stuff and start over, I made myself a new medal with a rather abstract Madonna on one side and a Sacred Heart on the other. And there was a priest in the class, and I really didn't know him very well, but I took the opportunity to take my medal to him and say, do you suppose something as wild as this could be blessed in the church? And he looked at me and said, I could do it right here. And he blessed my medal, and then he said, I didn't know you were a Catholic. And that started a series of conversations about what art ought to be and what art ought to be in the church. And then one day he said, my order is going to go to Texas to help start this new University of Dallas, and when I need a second man, I will call you. So a year and a half later, I get a phone call while I'm teaching in high school, and in his very humble Cistercian manner said, well, it's time to come now. Wait a minute, I'm married, I have a contract, I love this town we're in, we're camped out in the lake country outside Milwaukee. I'm not sure I want to go to a desert in Texas. We came down and looked around and found wonderful people, and that's been history. It's the miracle of my life. The second miracle was meeting O'Neill Ford, who was the architect of the building that was then going up on the University of Dallas campus. This was the first wing of what is now a very large art complex, very much enlarged a couple of years ago by Gary Cunningham. It was the first building we built for a special purpose on campus. At that time, 1960, the University of Dallas was two buildings. Long Carpenter Hall, little lecture hall, and two dorms on both sides. no gym, no student center, but we did have a new art building. And it was the genius of Neil Ford to put this way back in the woods, a very modest little structure. Now, I'm introducing you to somebody that you know by name, but perhaps he's the architect of the first buildings, the Mexican brick with the blue trim, built at about the same time or slightly after my art building, which is in the same mode. It was typical Neil stuff, brick walls, deck ceiling, heavy beams, and for me, very formative. I had no idea about architecture. My father was a builder of barns and fixing people's porches. He was a carpenter contractor. And I knew about structures, but in terms of the theory of architecture, I was a total novice. So I moved into this lovely building that belonged to Neil, and it has literally changed my life. Neil Ford was a character. He was a kind of character that would be put together by Hollywood and Central Casting and given all kinds of things to do. He growled at everything. He was slightly irascible, good-humored Irishman. He invented the O on his name. He was christened something Neil, and he decided O'Neill would be better if he was going to be Irish. His mother was an artist, a weaver. His brother was an artist, a carver and a sculptor and a maker of things. And he was a kind of maverick. He looked at a lot of contemporary architecture of the day, fancy, fancy stuff, and he said, well, I call that, look, Ma, no hands architecture, stuff that's just up there floating. He was very grounded in his architecture, and we're introducing somebody to you today that probably fits in that category that most of your heads kind of try to wrap around. You're in class every day and you open the book and there's a picture of somebody. There's somebody who's famous. He might have old powdered curly hair if he's a revolutionary or whatever. But I'm here to tell you that there is somebody in your life, in your background, in the ethos that you live with, who is an important figure. It's my job in the next 20 minutes to try to elucidate that importance. His architecture starts as an apprentice. Oh, by the way, he never did go to architecture school. He did take a correspondence course in architecture, and then he took his acumen to Dave Williams, who was an architect in Dallas at the time. And Dave Williams was attracted to a kind of native architecture that's found in country architecture, the kind of stone architecture of Fredericksburg and the hill country. Buildings that were modest in their form and very practical. Lots of breezeways before air conditioning, porches for shade and shelter, tin roof. Tin roofs in Texas were an easy application. If you were in colonial Northland in Massachusetts and the rest, you had a ready supply of very, very old growth red cedar, which splits very easily into shakes or shingles for roof. Texas doesn't have a supply like that, so it turned to the manufactured sheet steel, galvanized metal for standing seam roof that was usually built in place. It came in long strips of flat metal, and the workers turned the edges up and folded them together to make the standing seam. And if you keep painting them, they will literally last forever. So in South Texas, in the hill country, there are roofs that are now well over 100 years old. Unlike our shingles that get displaced every few years by hail. So he starts with a modest architectural form, and out of that, Dave Williams concocted a kind of architectural style that got rid of a lot of ornament and extra surfaces on things. You'll see the beams are revealed, the deck of the upper floor is revealed, the porch has the rafters exposed. Ordinarily in colonial architecture of the north and northwest, you would find this covered with lath and plaster, painted and wallpapered, another surface, as though there is a surface to the building which holds it up, which is fundamental form, and then there's another surface we glue on that to complement ourselves, to add the moldings, the paper, the columns, the capitals, the fanciness, so that we can prove to our neighbors that we understand what it's like to live in an expensive house. The adoration is not about how life is lived, the adoration is about what I can afford. So these are forms that came out of Dave Williams. Natural supporting brick used as brick, not painted as something else, and structures that are honest. In 1937, he teamed up as an architect with Arch Swank, a Dallas architect, and they were commissioned to do a small chapel in Denton at Texas Women's University. It's now called the Chapel in the Woods. And he put together a number of things that were floating in the air. One, of course, is the penury of not having enough money. It is a post-depression period, or really extended depression in 1937. And so the labor of this was accomplished by the students who were going to the college. They made the stained glass, they did the paintings, worked on the metal craft. But he also put together images that come out of architectural history, such as the shape of it, with the shed roof. It's like medieval hilltown Italian work. But inside he employed something else, and that's his coming genius of accepting new forms, of finding new relationships in architectural form. And in this he used the catenary arch. The catenary arch is exposed on the outside of the building, where the arches come out and act as buttresses on the outside of the wall. They pierce the wall and arc over to support the wood deck ceiling. Now, a catenary is an arch that's made by a hanging chain. If you hang a chain, you get an arc, a little bit like the Calatrava Bridge downtown. But the mystery of it is if you hang the chain low, you'll get a kind of low bridge support arch, or you can make a tall one, or anywhere between. And the magic of it is that any shape that you take from a hanging chain will be a supporting arch. It will bear the load on top because it takes the force and transfers it out to the ground on both sides. It's a kind of a miracle format. It's often used for kilns, for stacking bricks to fire bricks inside. It was his embrace of a rather modern form. It was used in Europe at the time to make large concrete shells in that catenary form as housing for dirigibles. That dirigible idea of a lighter-than-air craft that ended when the Hindenburg burned needed some place to shelter them, and they needed literally to fly into a building. They were humongous structures, and they found that the easiest way to do this was to build a concrete shell in a catenary form, and you could drive the dirigible in. When the Allies conquered Italy, they tried to destroy some of these in the Second World War. They set dynamite around the outside to blow them up, and they knocked out the lower half, and the arch just sat down and stayed. So you can keep cutting it off at the bottom, and it will just sink gradually. It's an enormously strong form, and one that Lyle used in a little church in the woods in Denton. When he started his own practice, one of the first ones is the Rock Creek Church in Rock Creek House in Dallas. And by the way, he always referred to these structures as houses, not homes. It was a sad day, he said, when the Home Builders Association decided that home building would be their title rather than house makers. He said, you don't build a home, you build a house, and you make it a home, or not. He used a number of images here that are in the modern vocabulary: plain window frames, French doors, flat roof, and an acknowledgement in modern architecture of the upper floor separated from the lower floor, which at that time was common in the early work of Frank Lloyd Wright. But there's also an interesting bay window that's pointed out as a prow. And he once told me that in his early buildings, when bay windows that pop out were popular, they were also expensive if you bought them from the millwork companies. And so they found a way to make a bay window cheaply by nailing together two French doors and let it poke out of the structure. And he's continued that in this house. It's also a hillside house. All of his work, when possible, was related to the land, and he liked to work on land that had a tilt to it, some kind of declivity, some kind of land rise that he could tuck into it, utilizing the lower floor on grade. Our first art building was placed back in the forest in the same way. You can enter on grade at the up floor and go out into the garden on the lower floor. He perched your building here on the edge of a precipice as well. You may not realize that when you drive into the parking lot that the hill you're facing is the natural slope of the hill. This is not an area that was planed off and built up, but you're sitting out here on the rise of the hill, and that's the natural drop that continues north and south of the structure. He tucked the building onto that top landscape. He was also enamored by the technology that surrounds the use of steel. He declared that steel is one of the lightest of metals, depending on how it's used. He decried the idea that we should ever use steel as a direct support in steel frames for skyscrapers and things, because it's a waste of the material. Listen to a show coming out of San Antonio, Public Affairs children's show, in which he was the author of a series of stories for children. He said, we live all our days in architecture, but nobody ever teaches architecture to anyone. So we live our lives, literally, in something we aren't taught anything about. We're addressing that a little bit today. But in that lecture, he said that one of the most interesting structures is the English racing bike. The English racing bike, narrow wheels, wire spokes. If you add anything to it, it's redundant. And if you take anything else away, it'll fail. It's absolutely at the tilt point in how a machine should be worked for maximum efficiency. And the wire wheel of the bicycle changed the nature of what a wheel was. The wheel, all the way back to the Egyptians when it was invented, it started out as a solid disc that rolled and would bear a weight pressing down from the axle. When it became a spoked wheel, like all of the wagons of the Old West or stagecoach and so on, the bottom spoke of the wheel acts as a column. It's supporting a weight directly down. And as that wheel moves, the next spoke takes over. So it's a series of columns that are literally moving. It's like a colonnade, except because it's a wheel, it has one center taking the force down. A bicycle wheel works in totally the opposite way. The center spoke, the weight, the force in a bicycle is suspended by the center wire. It hangs from above, and the bottom spoke doesn't do anything. It's hard to push a wire and have it be any kind of, well, push a noodle is a joke, but it's hard to push a wire and have it have any supporting strength. But a wire is enormously strong in tensile strength. So he posited, suppose we take a giant bicycle wheel and use it to cover a whole space. So this is one of his early projects in Denton. It still extant as a civic center, in which the bottom spool there has cables going out to the edges and then coming down from above, so it makes basically a bicycle wheel. Can you imagine a structure which will cover a vast space in which the support beam weighs nothing? When we look at a span across the space with a girder or a beam, whether it be a steel beam or a wood beam, that gadget is still very heavy to bear the load of the ceiling. This one is enormously light because it takes its power from the tension of the wires that come off acting as spokes. So literally, it's a freestanding gadget which is sitting on another drum as a support. On top of that then is a thin membrane roof. He moved to domestic architecture. This is on Hillcrest in Dallas, and became known as the modern architecture for Dallas. Architecture which is without ornament, that is without ornament or decoration that is added to the structure. Plain glazed windows, wooden frames, flat deck, and of course a very strong emphasis on the fireplace. The Haggerty Hannon home on Northbrook in Dallas, a very large home, very social home. Pat Haggerty was one of the founders and became the director of Texas Instruments, and the home was needed for entertainment. for business purposes, but it was also a hillside structure built on a limestone escarpment off of Bachman Creek. You come off the carport, which is the entrance to the house, down a flight of stairs. There's a door that is to the servants' quarters and to the kitchen for delivery purposes, and then down the stairs to an opening, a courtyard, and the door off to my left. I want to call your attention to the dark stripe across the deck ceiling there, in the way that Neil was always fascinated with how much work can we get the minimal amount of material to do. Ordinarily, that support that would hold up the deck would be a strong support resting on the poles, and he's turned it, he's used an angle iron that's about 4 inches across, and turned it flat and put a triangular piece of wood inside of it, screwed it in, and that's the nail joint holder for the deck that's overhead, minimizing the beam. So as you come down, you have the most minimal but strong structure to hold up the purpose, hold up the roof from these very slender little columns. It's a house that nestles inland. It again uses the same Mexican brick that's used here in Cistercian. The flight of stairs used to go up to an outdoor pool, and after the family left and Mrs. Haggerty needed the pool for daily exercise, it was converted to an indoor pool. The back side of the house looks out on a broad landscape lawn, mostly ground cover leading to Bachman Creek, a small pond from a dammed up section, and it's one long glazed wall of the living room, the dining room, and the family room, and the bedroom all in a row share one kind of common wall divided by brick dividers. He liked the richness of materials, brick used as brick sometimes in ornamental ways, and wood used in ways that it could be manipulated, such as the chevron pattern for this interior doorway. He also employed his brother, who was an artist, Linford, to make the moldings and the carved doors and the ornament for the structure. This is the living room looking out onto the garden, which was landscaped by 2 long-time venerable architects, landscape architects, Arthur and Marie Berger, who landscaped most of the houses for Neil Ford, including the Rock Creek House and the Northbrook House. Now, architects don't arise out of, how do I say, out of thin air. We all have our own influences, and I'm talking this morning about Neil Ford's influence on my house and my life and family, and the input of the University of Dallas on my intellectual life. I've after all only had one job in my lifetime, so it's all in one box, as it were. I want to take you a little side trip here for a couple of other architects to talk about how influence works and how it gets in. And I want you to think about how the architecture that you're experiencing here by Neil Ford and by Gary will be actually getting into your intellectual life and into your very soul as well. That you begin to absorb how things are put together, the naturalness of things or the rightness of things along the way. This happens to be a series of cottages put together in the early 19th century when Cornish miners came to Wisconsin to mine lead. Wisconsin is the Badger State. It's called that because of the badger holes that the miners used. The lead was so close to the surface that you could literally dig a hole in the yard and encounter a vein of lead inside the limestone layers. The houses were built on the hillside by literally quarrying into the hill and extracting enough stone to then set up the structure for the house itself. This one has had a long addition to the top. Often the back rooms would become tunnels or cold rooms for the storage of food and vegetables and milk as they were buried in the hill. From the garden side, you can see an accumulation of forms where the house has grown, part timber, chimney. Now, it's the same county that is the home county for a more famous international architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, who grew up, his family was Welsh, close to Cornish, and he grew up with this kind of native architecture. And in his own theories, he wrote about how a house sits on stone. The fireplace comes down to the rock base, and it's laid up stone. This is the interior of, I apologize for the loose slide, this is the interior of his own home at Taliesin in Spring Green, Wisconsin. And you can see how many forms are found in the generic architecture of the place. The use of wood, the layering, the natural stone, particularly the geometric shapes in which the stone walls are laid up. As the stone comes out of the ground in multiple layers, one will be 2 inches, 1 inch, 4 inches, and it breaks clean on those layers as it was laid down in sedimentary limestone at some point in the Earth's distant past. Those shapes, the angle of the ceiling, the use of wood, the beams, the stripes, and the stone are all a part of Frank Lloyd Wright's heritage, and they find their way eventually into Wisteria, just as the houses in the hill country, the German settlers who settled the lower part of Wisconsin, Texas, the area in the hill country and south of there, Czech and Germans brought with them the same frugal attitudes. Stone laid up as it came out of the quarry, the tin roof, and the modest shelter. That was a kind of indigenous architecture. It's not made by architects, it's simply made by the stonemason who knows how to lay up a house. And incidentally can build a fireplace in several patterns that are carried within his own self. There's another route into Neil's foundation, and that's his understanding of a modern architect from Scandinavia, the Finnish architect Alvar Aalto, who used brick in very honest and natural forms. This is an Aalto house in Finland, and part of his interior shows a predilection for the use of wood sticks and wood stripes in the ceiling, which shows up in many of Neil's structures. By the way, I noticed this morning that the bentwood chair that's used in Gary's chapel is an Alvar Aalto chair. The architect of this direction is one that Gary chose as the bentwood chair that's used in the chapel over there. These are like minds, nearly a century apart, finding a consonance in contemporary use. He liked brick in ways that are laid up in very natural forms. And there are a couple of roots for this. One of them is the native way that bricklayers around the country, and he used to always refer to him as El Señor. The way El Señor lays up brick is found in the courthouse squares in Texas. You know, the high fronts with a series of bricks that are set out or recessed or set at an angle. They make a crenellated pattern across the top, and no architect drew that. The courthouse squares were ordered, the structures were ordered by the railroad. They came with steel columns and glass fronts and a cast iron set of frames for the store windows, and you added the timber and the brick walls and the roof, and you had a store. And then you hooked the next building onto it, so you had a common wall construction between one store or the other. But the place where there was some self-expression was when the bricklayer, Neil Ford's El Señor, would decorate the top the way he wanted. The other route is the Roman use of concrete and brick. Roman structures were laid up with brick shuttering on the outside, and they poured concrete between. And that's the way the tower is built at Trinity University and the way the UD Tower is built. UD Tower we watched go up as 2 cylinders of brick. Bricklayers laying an interior and a 6-sided outside pattern, and when they got up to a level of the day's work, that would have steel added inside, and they poured full of concrete. And the ring on the outside where the bricklayers laid was jacked up that high. The next day they would simply go up another level. When they were done, they came down and cleaned the outside but it's pure Roman architecture. The Pantheon, the baths of ancient Rome, the baths of Caracalla, are all brick structures with brick on the outside and then junk inside. Roman concrete full of broken stone, broken brick. When you think about it, it's a wonderful economical way to work because nobody has to haul off the trash. Think about building a city the size of Rome, and everything is cut and chiseled stone with lots of chips, lots of broken brick and leftover stuff. How do you suppose you're going to put that in a wheelbarrow and walk 4 miles to the edge of the city and dump it off? It doesn't make any sense, but how neat if you just take all the trash of the construction, which has to be brick and rock, and you just dump it in the slot between and bury it in the concrete. Neil used that in one of his chapels in San Antonio where he laid up wooden walls on the outside, stacked stone inside, big rocks, and then poured concrete between them to lock it all together, revealing rough stone on the outside of the wall and concrete working its way through it. The towers are that way. They are, in a sense, Roman construction. We don't throw trash inside. We use ordinary concrete and steel. He pioneered another adventuresome way of building our dormitories. This one was done in San Antonio at Trinity University, and he cast the floor on the ground and then covered it with a sheet of plastic and cast the second floor right on top of it, laid a sheet of plastic and poured another one on top of that, and there were holes in them, and then he jacked them up and put the columns between them as they went up. Now I think it's incredibly dangerous to build a building on the ground and jack it up in the air, but it seemed to work. I don't know whether it caught on or whether it's economically efficient or whether it's something he just wanted to try out. All of his buildings had some kind of adventure like that in it. This is in San Antonio at University of Texas, San Antonio. It's an outside shade shed of great height. This is no low-level shade shed like you find at a nursery. Look at the scale of those columns, and then the hanging sheets of slats of wood overhead to act as a mitigating factor for the sun overhead. Back to 1960, first wing of our art building, a concrete block building with a wood deck overhead. It was stuccoed on the outside. Rather than the Mexican brick that he was used to, he gave in because the Cistercian priest wanted stucco, claiming that it was more attractive to Hungarians than bare brick. It seems that in Hungary, bare brick is a poor building, and a stucco building is an expensive building. But in America, we like our brick on the outside, and the stucco is a cheap cover-up. So we got, the Hungarian got his way. We had the second building in 1965, joined by a garden given by Mrs. Haggerty. This is the upper part of the, you're standing on the upper slope of the hill, showing the integration of those two buildings in the forest. The forest was not very large at that time. The hilltop at the University of Dallas was cut off and shaved by the Carpenter Ranch, of which it was a part in the 40s, for pasture land. And what we scraped away, as you can see by the trees along the building over there, are very small second growth, pretty dense material. One larger one escaped the bulldozer here at the top of the garden. When we built the first building, the tree scape around there was about 12 feet tall, not much higher than the eave line of the building. It furnished us with a lovely gallery, furnished with Danish modern furniture, cutting-edge material of the day. We one time received an exhibit of prints from a gallery in London. We were one of the few galleries in Dallas at that time. There were only 3 galleries in town, and we added the 4th one out here. Many people came out for 2 reasons. One, to see the new art, and the other was to see what Neil Ford was building in town, because he was the boyhood friend of most of the movers and shakers of older Dallas. When we got the show, it came as unmounted prints, and we were at a loss as to how to display them because we couldn't afford backboard or frames for them. So we decided to treat them, as this was a studio building, the way a print is treated right after it's printed. It hung up with clips or clothespins on a wire. So we cover the cement block walls with strips of no-seam paper, big sheets of paper that are sold for decoration in stores, and then hung the prints by strings and ribbons in a way that we would thought that matches the naturalness of the rest of the buildings. We begin to see the building working on our psyche. We begin to treat our behavior in ways that the building is structured. In 1968, we opened the Granite Graduate Building, our largest building on the mall. It was the cheapest building we ever built. At the time, construction costs for the art building were $25 a square foot. Gary told me this morning to add a zero or two to that, so you get $250 a foot. Excuse me. When Neil designed the Granite building, his ingenuity lowered the cost of this building to $17 a square foot. When the modest art building was $25, this was $17. And it was allowed that to happen by taking all of the multiple parts of it and reducing them down to their simplest possible cost. So that, for instance, we have a wonderful facade which is full of windows on all four sides. The building is symmetrical, but there are no window frames. So you take out the cost of window frames, either aluminum frames, or the cost of framing, or wood frames. There is instead a slot laid up in the brick by El Señor when he's laying the brick, about an inch wide, and in it goes a rubber band. And into that rubber band is pressed a sheet of plate glass, and another rubber band goes in behind it and is pushed in place by a screwdriver, and that's it. Inside the building, there are no ducts for return air. Rather, the large courtyard in the center acts as a gathering place for all the air. The heating and cooling air comes in through the fluorescent lights, where it also captures the ambient heat of the fluorescent light, which is not terribly much. But instead of having extra holes in the wall for radiators, there's a little slot alongside the light fixture, and the hotter air, cold air comes in. It flows out through the louver doors in the classroom into the center, which acts as a gathering place for all of it. So that you save the ductwork, the cost of ductwork of return air, and you save the cost of puncturing the walls and fitting in all the radiators and all the registers, and of course the window frames as well. Along with that, the building is on a 9-foot module, meaning the walls are 9 foot high. The plywood that lines all the classrooms, the dark oak paneling, came pre-finished on the box, finished at the factory. No individual staining and finishing on site. They come out of the box and they go up on the wall as the buildings are, or the rooms are set in a 9-foot module as well. So very little trimming, very little extra work. The building just goes together. Because the grant that we got, $7.5 million at the time to build the graduate school, included $1.5 million for the Granite building and the mall and the tower, to be a memorial to Tom and Bess Braniff of the Braniff Airways that are now long gone. He hired an internationally known planner, Sam Zisman, who was a German Jew who was hired by Konrad Adenauer, the mayor of Cologne, to refigure Cologne after the war and the Allied damage. And it's Zisman's plan to build the mall, anchor the campus with a tower at one end, Granite building at the other, and then other buildings down the wall, giving us a central spine as the social and intellectual center. Along the way, we added to the cafeteria, and it's the same simple thing. On the north side, the cold side, you get the flank wall. On the east side, for the morning sun. You get the fenestration of the windows, and overhead is the deck. There are, of course, the wonderful lanterns with many holes in them, and these were made by art students in exchange for money to build kilns out of the general contract. That image of a plan, and Gary will come to talk about the plan and the organization of this site as a campus, has served us very well. Every once in a while there's a problem with the mall because the land shifts and there's some kind of discussion, well, maybe we should take it up and put grass. I tell you that the cost of maintaining this part of the land without ever having to mow it, clean it, rake it, over the years has been a great saving to us. Neil's last building for us, one of the last two, was the science building on the far side. Very simple brick building with regular fenestration on the outside, which connected to a porch of a previous building, the Science Lecture Center. And there is a passageway, the gateway to the center campus. Neil passed away while the science building was being built. In the same design contract was the chapel of the Church of the Incarnation and the science building. He gave this to a young couple, Dwayne and Jane Landry, who worked out of their Neil's office as young people. He had a habit of bringing young architects in for a while, training them well, and then setting them up out in the firm. Dallas is full of architects who passed through his office. But this building is decorated with spectacular lanterns in copper that are made by Isaac Maxwell, himself an architect who became a lantern maker, continuing the tradition of Neil Ford's brother, Lynn Ford. We've also used his image and his planning to regularize parts of the campus that weren't built by Neil Ford. And some of that you'll find going on in Gary's city plan here for this campus, where stone walls are added to make the connection between the building and the geometry of the sidewalk, the setback, the raise, the plaza, and then the brick of older buildings. Late in life, he was commissioned to do the Patrick and Bernice Haggerty Museum at Marquette University. Pat Haggerty of Texas Instruments was a graduate of the engineer school at Marquette. Mrs. Haggerty went to Mount Mary. At that time, there were boys' schools and girls' schools in Catholic education. And this is on the site of Holy Angels Elementary School, very, very near where Beatrice went to school as an elementary school student, right next to the campus of Marquette. One of the good ladies of Marquette, in their fundraising, came up with the idea of a museum. Marquette had a very large art collection scattered around the campus, gifts from various years, and no place to display it, or no public gallery. When the ladies gathered, and of course they wanted Mrs. Haggerty to give a lead gift for the museum, she said, "I'll give the gift if I can name the architect." Well, that didn't set very well with the ladies of Wisconsin. They would have preferred a Wisconsin architect, but they gave in. And when it was finished, the Haggerty Museum won the top award that year for an architectural structure in Wisconsin. He met problems in various ways. This is the office entrance for the International Motor Works Volkswagen company in San Antonio. The problem was it was on a lot with very large live oak trees, 40 feet tall and of great girth. And the problem was how to put it in without destroying the trees. So Neil came up with a particularly ingenious way. How do you move a 40-foot live oak tree of great girth? And his idea was to dig a trench around it, down about 8 feet, and then build a trench, box that in with timber, very strongly, build a trench some feet away, maybe 20 feet away or so, and then wet the soil under in the pit, put a cable beneath, and tow it underneath to cut the roots of the tree. Then with a bulldozer, you simply slide the tree in its box on the mud over to its new site. And it works. You can drive a big tree across the street if you've got enough gadgets around it. Very successful, and it, of course, increased his fame in San Antonio. At the end of Lynn's life, his family had a great cachet of carved panels of slats of wood, panels for doors, and the work that usually ornamented Neil's buildings. So members of that family living in Denton contacted the architects Dwayne and Jane Landry, Senior, Dwayne on the far side and Jane on this side, and asked them if they would do something with it. They came to me and said, could I make some wood panels covered with leather on which we could display these in the library in Denton. But being embarrassed to ask me to make panels for that, they said, well, how about your sons doing this? So these back panels were made by my son Michael and Gregory Novinski and presented to the architects who then assembled this memorial. These are images that introduce you somewhat to the life of an interesting character. I just want you to be aware that, as Gary said, moving around the campus, that you're aware that the shapes that you are being educated in have a fundamental honesty to them, have a fundamental way of honoring the way material should be used, the way things go together, and that you will find in your own life some kind of analogy between that and the way your own growth will happen. Thank you much.